Welcome, everybody, to Unraveling the Unexplained. I am Kat, and I am a longtime astral traveler and spirit consultant. This is my brother John, a longtime fan of the creepy and paranormal.
Hello, folks.
He has picked out a video for me to check out. I don't know what it is, but we're about to find out together.
Whilst it can be said that there are many cases of the paranormal that have the ability to leave one unsettled, very rarely does one encounter a truly chilling, truly horror movie-esque happening that, despite its difficult to digest details, is claimed to have been 100% real. In the February of 1840, a young destitute family moved into a modest ground-floor apartment in the small German town of Mottlingen. 2 brothers and 3 sisters, the Ditterses were orphans, the parents of the family having died some time earlier, leaving their eldest child, a young man by the name...
Can I just say that old-timey photos are kind of scary just by themselves?
Just kind of that weird faded grayscale everything's in, and nobody
and their eyes look dead, and it's just...
Not. I've seen a lot of old photos, and not a lot of people look happy in those old photos.
No, there's actually, we won't get into it here, but there's a long history of smiling, and then for a long time in history, smiling was considered weird and inappropriate and not the thing to do.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
There's like a whole anti-smiling movement.
Yeah, for long periods of history, smiling was considered creepy, like only weird perverts smiled at you, and to show your teeth to other people was like, that's what feral dogs do. So...
Wow.
Smiling as a sign of happiness that's actually a fairly recent thing in human history.
That explains so much about old
It does.
paintings and photos and stuff where everybody just looks so deadpan and unhappy.
Yeah, that was considered proper and respectable to look like that in a photo. Anyway, not what we're here to talk about, but facts,
That's
people.
an unfortunate pause.
name of Andreas to care for his siblings. His brother was half blind, and his youngest sister, a devout 24-year-old, suffered ongoing ill health. Her name was Gottlieben, and despite her faithfulness, she was destined, so it seemed, to find herself at the center of what can only be described as the most horrific, most gruesome, and quite possibly most well-documented case of demonic possession and exorcism in all history.
Nice.
The Ditterses were a poor family, and so the home into which they moved in early 1840 can be described as little other than ramshackled, with all members of the family commenting, as soon as they moved in, how they heard recurring creaks, bangs, and shuffles, almost as though the building was straining to get away from itself. But these were no ordinary noises. They seemed to come from every nook and corner, and would sometimes last all night, scuffling and trampling across the bedroom. From the very first day, Gottlieben Ditters was wary of her new home. For certainly, on the first day of their arrival, when she prayed at the table, "Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest," she had fits in which she fell onto the floor unconscious. After that, a change, it is said, came over her. A once respected young woman of unsullied reputation, Gottlieben was now avoided by others in the town. Widely disliked, she is said to have had something repulsive and inexplicable in her behavior, and a repugnant way about her. At the time, however, little was said about it, her altered personality being ascribed to the tragedy of her being an orphan. Then, in the autumn of 1841, Gottlieben approached Johann Christoph Blumhardt, a Lutheran theologian who had moved to the area in 1838 and now served as the town's pastor. Zealous and devoted, he was 36 years old at the time and was eager to listen to the young woman's spiritual grievances. It was seemingly in a state of desperation that she visited Blumhardt at his parsonage and told him of the nightly temptations which she suffered. They had, she explained to him, reached an ever higher degree, and as such brought her much torment. Other than this, however, she would not disclose any more. Highly reticent about her strange experiences, and yet clearly distressed by them. It was in December, only a few weeks later, that Blumhardt and Gottlieben's paths crossed again. The young woman had fallen ill, dangerously so. She was attended to by medical doctors, and also Blumhardt, who visited her so as to pray over her. And yet, as strong as his spiritual calling was, the pastor disliked tending to her. Whenever he entered the room in which she lay, the young woman would look at him out of the corner of her eye, silent and without greeting him. She would not pay any attention to his words, and would even seem nearly unconscious in his presence, something which Blumhardt considered her to be feigning, for she had not been in such a condition before or after his visits. There was then, it seems, something inexplicable and eerie about Gottlieben that unsettled everyone around her. That we know all that we do about Gottlieben is thanks to Blumhardt, specifically the report which he wrote some 3 years later about the young woman, her family, and the phenomena which, all too quickly, overwhelmed all those involved. Writing in his report, he explained that 2 of Gottlieben's relatives came to him seeking advice. Events at the apartment had become so out of control that they could no longer be concealed. The bizarre trampling sounds were now so loud that the entire neighborhood could hear them. Not only that, Gottlieben was acting especially strange. She claimed, horrifically, that she saw with special frequency the figure of a woman from the area who had died 2 years previous. This woman, so Gottlieben reported, would always stand in the same place in front of her bed, holding a dead child in her arms. Thus, this was how the pastor first learnt something about the ghost in the Ditter's house. According to Gottlieben's testimony, the spectrum...
So, okay.
All right, so what are you thinking so far?
Well, I'm just recapping so far, because it's a little bit vague. And you can correct me if you're hearing the same thing, if you think I'm wrong. But it sounds to me like back in the day, before anybody understood anything about mental health, a young woman who was uprooted from where she was, moved into a new neighborhood, into a bad environment, a crappy house.
Yeah.
Suffered from depression. She wasn't her normal, cheerful, perky Christian self or whatever, which I think
she
under the circumstances...
basically became more withdrawn and not...
Right, is not terribly unheard of, right?
Yeah.
It does sound like there was some weird things happening in the house, but they're not being very, I don't know what having nightly temptations means.
That could mean so much stuff.
Right, like what does that mean? I'm not sure how to interpret
that particular one, but it's clear that this young lady was going through some stuff.
Yeah, it does sound at the very least like a serious bout of depression and then also illness. I don't think it's abnormal for somebody who is sick to not be looking at you or listening particularly well. You know what I mean? Like, so far it sounds like she had a serious bout of depression and mental illness after a blow to her family moved her out of her environment and stuff.
And the environment wasn't exactly conducive with the people and it being kind of, well, dicks.
Yeah, it's a different neighborhood. She's the new girl in town. She's acting depressed, and, you know, back in the day when women acted depressed, they treated it like it was a case of the crazies. Do you know what I mean?
And it doesn't sound like the pastor was exactly a help.
No, it doesn't sound like anyone was particularly a help. So far, it sounds like a serious case of depression or whatever that turned into illness. Now, it looks like they're about to get into what was actually happening in the house at the time, but that kind of, just that environment, that kind of energy... It's not
a good recipe for good vibes.
No, it's not a good recipe for good vibes. And depending on how attuned she was to begin with, she may have been...
already
generating a kind of thing, yeah.
Right. Let's see how this goes.
A woman would at times move towards her, still holding the deceased infant, whereafter she would repeat the words, "I want to be left alone," or "Give me paper, and I won't come back." There would also be shimmers of light in the room, a phenomenon which was witnessed by others who stayed in the apartment. Gottlieben was instructed not to engage with the phantom. Whatever the manifestation's purpose was, the pastor concluded it could only be bad. And certainly not long afterwards, half a piece of paper was discovered under a bed at the threshold of the bedroom door. It was covered in soot and all written upon. Due to the soot, it was illegible, but next to it there had been placed several coins, each wrapped in paper dusted with soot. From what could be ascertained, the writing seemed to be a prescription, possibly of magic. Where it or the coins had come from, no one knew. A couple of weeks later, a light flickering on the floor behind the stove revealed a whole number of things which had been buried there. Salt, chalk, bones, and yet more coins wrapped in sooty paper. After examination, it was feared that these items may have been remnants of some black magic, and so, accepting the coins, the pastor burnt them all. The strangeness, however, did not conclude with the fire. In fact, if anything, it escalated. In his report, Blumhardt goes into detail about how the peculiar noises in the apartment, most especially the sound of trampling footsteps, were so loud and so frequent that passers-by were scared. One could hear it during the day as well as the night, often when no one was in the living room. On those occasions when Gottlieben was in the room, it was worse still. The table would be shook violently as the trampling noises sounded all around her. By this point, everyone in Mottlingen seems to have had at least some small measure of awareness of the case. As for the pastor, he appears to have been somewhat sceptical. Appealing to the mayor and several other men from the town council, he arranged for an investigation of the Ditter's home to be conducted. And so, arriving in the evening unexpectedly, they proceeded to comb through the apartment. As soon as Blumhardt entered the living room, 2 immense bangs allegedly sounded from the bedroom. In a short time, others followed. Noises, bangs, and knockings of the most varied kind were heard mostly in the bedroom, where Gottlieben lay on her bed, fully dressed. When the pastor said a short prayer, with the rest singing a hymn around him, the activity increased. Supposedly, windows rattled, chairs leapt from the floor, and sand fell from the ceiling. In the space of 3 hours, 25 bangs were heard towards a certain spot in the bedroom. When the floorboards there were removed so as to determine the source of the banging, yet more magical oddities were supposedly discovered. Scraps of paper, mysterious powders, small packages of money, and chillingly, a pot which contained small bones mixed with earth. The very next day, after attending church in the morning, Gottlieben was found at home in a deep faint and near death. According to Blumhardt, who rushed to aid her, the young woman was lying on her bed, quite stiff. The skin of her head and arms was glowing and trembling, but the rest of her body indicated suffocation. Despite medical doctors attempting to revive her, nothing could be done to help her. Half an hour later, she awakened. Trembling, she whispered to the pastor that she had seen her again. The dead woman with the dead child. Returning home after church, the spectre, so Gottlieben claimed, had been waiting for her, infant in arms, in the living room. Upon seeing her, the young woman had fainted. And so, after this, for Blumhardt, there was no saying otherwise. There truly was something strange and terrible going on in the home of the Ditter's family. Anxious that things were getting out of hand, Blumhardt found alternative accommodation for Gottlieben. The apartment, he believed, was the cause of the activity, thus removing her from it would resolve the situation. By the summer of 1842, the tramplings and other strange sounds were being experienced in the new house. Somehow they had followed Gottlieben. Not just that, the activity had grown more extreme, with the unfortunate young woman supposedly suffering frequent violent convulsions. These became ever stronger and longer lasting, so that many times she would hardly be free for 5 minutes in between. Now intimately involved in the case, often visiting Gottlieben so as to act as her spiritual advisor, Blumhardt was able to record many details about her experiences. She would faint in front of him, tremble and convulse, so much so that every muscle in her head and her arms was in glowing motion, although she was rigid and stiff otherwise. Often foam would flow out of her mouth. She would twist her arms, turn her head, lift her body up high, all while unconscious. Sometimes this would last for hours, with a doctor who was tending to her helpless to do anything. It was, in short, horrifying. Such activity continued for several days, until Blumhardt could only conclude that something demonic played a role in the young woman's suffering. After all, on one occasion, when she regained consciousness, Gottlieben confided in the pastor that she had seen something floating in front of her eyes which made her rigid. And so it was that during one of her violent episodes, the pastor, unable to tolerate seeing the young woman suffer any longer, jumped up and, in his own words, took her stiff hands, pulled her fingers together with force as for prayer, loudly spoke her name into her ear in her unconscious state, and said, "Fold your hands and pray. Lord Jesus, help me. We have seen long enough what the devil is doing. Now we also want to see what Jesus can do." According to Blumhardt's report, after a moment she awakened, prayed those words, and the convulsions stopped. Everyone in the room, Blumhardt included, was silently shocked. Until that moment, Blumhardt, a Lutheran pastor unused to the uncompromising and combatant rite of exorcism deployed by his Catholic counterparts, had not thought to take a stand against the violent happenings in such a way. Then, one day, everything worsened. According to the pastor's written report, the possessing force, despite being banished by prayer, returned with a stronger energy, almost as though its rage had been renewed and emboldened by attempts to exorcise it. Summoned to the house once more, Blumhardt reportedly discovered Gottlieben in a terrible state. Lying on her bed, her entire body was in motion, and she made horrible faces, her only intention being wrath and rage as she tried to reach for the pastor in an attempt to hurt him. As before, he started to pray and say the name of Jesus. At that, the young woman immediately rolled back her eyes and began to speak. Only the voice with which she spoke could instantly be recognized as not being hers, not only because of the tone, but because of the expression and character of it. "I cannot stand to hear that name," the voice is alleged to have said. All in the room were terrified. Even so, Blumhardt proceeded to engage the voice in conversation. And so it was that he, so he detailed in his report, discovered the identity of the entity that was possessing Gottlieben. Or rather, entities, as horrifically 14 demons are said to have inhabited her body. Not only that, they were led, so it seemed, by the spirit of the murderess whom Gottlieben had claimed to have seen haunting her home. She, so Blumhardt explained, identified herself as a killer of 2 children. She had buried them in the field, and for that was condemned to a restless afterlife. I cannot pray. That is the reward for my deeds. A practitioner of dark magic, the voice claimed that she was forever bound to do the devil's bidding. Thus, in his bondage, she was determined to make Gottlieben suffer. As incredible as these claims may be, Blumhardt took great care to present them in a clear and precise manner in the report he later produced for his superiors, all of which heightens the incredible and breathtakingly diabolical nature of this case. After all, Gottlieb's face, he wrote, changed each time a new voice took over, with a new threatening expression being assumed. Many threatening words are said to have been spoken to the pastor, with the entities possessing the young woman clear that they would have loved to have harmed him, even if, for some reason, they were not allowed to. And so, instead, they took their rage out on others present in the room, including the mayor, who is said to have received many a knock and fist blow, as well as Gottlieben herself. She tore her hair, threw her head against the wall, and tried to hurt herself in many ways. To Blumhardt, it was painfully obvious that the poor young woman was not in control of her own body, and that her only salvation was prayer. For certainly, if his words are to be believed, commanding the demons to leave the woman's body worked. With simple words, the pastor was supposedly able to rebuke every movement and force them to obey. And yet, all too quickly, they would return, with their sinister power becoming stronger again and again. It seemed as though his work only made things worse. The devil, so he claimed, was trying to ensnare him in his own pride. And so Blumhardt rose above it, and returned to Gottlieben, determined at all costs to free her from the demons which sought to destroy both her and him.
This is a really sad case.
Yeah. Your thoughts so far?
Yeah, you can see how, okay, there's a lot to unpack here. The young girl has obviously got connection. This is a young psychic who doesn't know she has abilities to see things, to interact with things.
Yeah.
She was seeing originally
just a ghost.
The woman with the baby, right? And it is possible, again, if there was a woman who had, for whatever reason, back in the day was a hard time for people. If you had too many babies you couldn't feed,
Things don't go well.
So, and again, you're operating in a culture that has some serious beliefs about what happens when you're a bad person when you die.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So you have some serious issues with spirits when they transition, humans when they transition being terribly afraid of hell. And so they don't cross over. They don't want to face whatever it is they think is going to happen. and they end up in an astral state on this plane still. And if you hang out there long enough, you start trying to poke at humans, start trying to gain attention, start, you know what I mean? And the spirit came across someone who could see her, someone who could interact.
Yeah.
And someone who didn't know
how to deal with
how to deal with it, how to defend themselves, how to operate with that energy, right? So you have a vulnerable young psychic who doesn't know anything about how to control her energy, doesn't know or believe in anything but Jesus. So when you invoke Jesus, again, it's the belief.
It's a protective thing.
It's the belief of the person whose energy is being affected that matters. So when you're invoking the only thing that person really actually believes in, it's a protective thing. We can talk about this more, but this is a really sad case of a time period when people just didn't have any understanding about what to do with cases like this at all. If you're dealing with a spirit, and it sounds like she actually became a conduit for multiple shadow entities. Like, once you're an open channel,
it's not an easily closed door.
Once you're an open channel, like, other spirits will start to come through, that energy draws. So it sounds like there are multiple spirits drawn to her at this point. She's just an open channel at this point with no ability to control what's happening.
Yeah.
And feeling like a victim of this situation rather than having any power or control over what's happening for her. It's a really sad and scary thing to have happen. And especially when the only person who's helping you is when you're throwing the name of Jesus at spirits who already don't want to go to hell and believe, you're dealing in a belief structure that becomes combative. And so the combative energy, the situation almost always escalates.
Whether you're alive or dead, there's an unfortunate human instinct to escalate affairs.
Right. Human is human, whether you're alive or passed on,
Yeah.
and the combative situation almost always escalates.
Yeah.
So, okay, we can finish watching it, but thus far, very sad situation that was just very not handled correctly by anybody, but we can talk about the right ways to do that later.
Very soon, the 14 demons multiplied until, sensationally, a tremendous 425 separate demonic entities are said to have lived inside the possessed woman. Blumhardt, praying over her, fought to banish them all. At night, whenever he was not there, Gottlieben claimed that shadows, dark figures, pressed around her bed. On one occasion, she even alleged to have felt herself suddenly seized on her neck by a burning hand. When her aunt, who was caring for her at the time, rushed with a light to inspect the young woman, she saw that large blisters, already filled with liquid, had risen all around her neck. The next day, the injuries were confirmed by a doctor. It is recorded that her neck took several weeks to heal. And so one gets a sense of how the details of this case are not merely terrifying, but also tremendous and extensive. According to Blumhardt's report, which was translated into English and published in the 1970s, Gottlieben suffered many physical injuries throughout her alleged demonic possession, both at the hands of unseen forces, such as those which burnt her neck, and herself. Many times Blumhardt went to attend her and found her with a new wound or hurt. Her chest beaten, her hair tore out, her nose bleeding, her body swollen extraordinarily. She would even, he claimed, vomit whole buckets of water. One of the most harrowing episodes is said to have begun on the evening of the 24th of July, 1842. Blumhardt states that he battled from 8 o'clock in the evening until 4 o'clock the next morning, all without result. In the following days, still tortured by what Gottlieben herself referred to as a plague, the young woman became more and more emaciated. The nighttime attacks, so it is said, had escalated to new and perverse planes, with her suffering painful and strong hemorrhages after being assaulted by spirit-like figures for up to 3 hours at a time. Far from being a figment of her imagination, the young woman was, on multiple occasions, reportedly discovered on her bed, swimming in blood, which forced itself through her dress everywhere on the upper part of her body. If this plague did not stop, she is said to have told the pastor in a moment of lucidity, it would be her death. And certainly, the medical doctor who had been attending her throughout was utterly confounded. According to Blumhardt, he had tried all sorts of medical means without being able to bring about her healing. Gottlieben's demonic possession is said to have reached a monstrous peak the following month, in August 1842. when one of the voices possessing her claimed to be but one of 1,067 entities. Many voices are said to have spoken that night, some speaking in accents and other languages, most such as Blumhardt could not compare to any European language. In his report, Blumhardt describes many conversations he had with possessing entities, including one with the spirit of the woman who had, in some way, started the whole ordeal. He wrote that she, like many of the possessing entities, desired to be free of the devil. After talking with her, praying for her, he was able to convince her to leave the body of the young woman and move on elsewhere. According to the pastor, in this fashion it continued for a while. Whatever spirit was given a resting place did not return again. Many identified themselves by formally giving their names, which was done especially by those who had died since I had been installed as pastor in this town in 1838. Others mentioned places they were from, often hundreds of hours away. Some even said they came from America. Gottlieben had then, it seemed, acted as a host to many disparate and diabolical entities. But why? The answer, so it seemed, was dark magic. On the 8th of February, so Blumhardt wrote, a new period began in the history of Gottlieben's possession. Sinisterly, it is claimed that objects were charmed into her body. At first, it was small pieces of glass, which the young woman would expel via vomit. Soon, it is said, this progressed to small pieces of iron, and then old bent nails, with Blumhardt himself claiming to have witnessed, with his own eyes, the young woman retching up into a bowl 12 separate nails on one occasion. Unbelievably, she was soon, so he claimed, vomiting shoe buckles, often so large that one could hardly understand how they could even come up her throat, as well as uncountable quantities of pins, lengths of wire, pieces of knitting needles, sometimes singularly and sometimes bound in bundles, tied together with feathers and paper. On one chilling occasion, Gottlieben is even said to have stopped breathing and lay as dead for several minutes when an especially large and broad piece of iron got stuck on its way out. Tremendously, even living animals, frogs, bats, and locusts are said to have come from her mouth. Each time one of these vomiting episodes occurred, Gottlieben was left in such pain that she would more or less lose consciousness. As far as Blumhardt was concerned, not merely was fraud on her part impossible, the incredible happenings having been witnessed by multiple people, but also entirely unimaginable given her level of suffering. Confessing the circumstance of her early years to Blumhardt, Gottlieben revealed that one of her childhood illnesses had been cured through the use of magical medications. Such, supposedly, had drawn her into the net of magic, something made all the worse by a cousin who she went to live with at the age of 7. Feared as an evil person, it was suggested that she had somehow pledged the girl's soul to the devil. Both Gottlieben's sister, Katharina, and her half-blind brother are described as having fallen under the same demonic influence as their sibling. For the first time in the 2-year-long possession, Katharina raged and threatened to tear the pastor into 1,000 pieces. She was allegedly so violent that she had to be restrained. Her behavior was entirely uncharacteristic. Bound, a demon then supposedly spoke through her. It was firm and declared itself to be not a spirit of a deceased person, but a prominent angel of Satan. As midnight approached, the young woman's rage increased, with her being seized with such violent shakings that it was as if she would shake off every limb individually. Then, so Blumhardt writes, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the supposed angel of Satan roared, while the girl bent her head and upper part of her body back over the backrest of the chair, with a voice of which one could hardly have believed a human throat capable. Jesus is victor! Jesus is victor! And after that, the power and strength of the demon seemed to be broken more with every moment. It became ever more quiet and calmer, and finally disappeared unnoticed, like the life-light of a dying person goes out, however, not until 8 o'clock in the morning. Katharina, along with her sister and brother, was free, and so, horrifically, thankfully, finally, the possession was over. These terrible and incredible events were described by Blumhardt in a report he wrote the following year. The document's purpose was, so he explained in the preface, to be honest and open, and more than that, to respond to the urge which he felt within himself to tell it all. After all, at the moment of writing, he knew all too well the judgment that he risked in sharing what he referred to as his battle and conflict with Satan. Jesus, he declared, is victor, and it was in his name that he had worked. No matter what judgments might be, I have the satisfaction of having spoken the truth. As for Gottlieben Dittus, a postscript added by Blumhardt in July 1850 revealed that a full 6 years later she was well and had moved into his home some 4 years previous to help his wife with housekeeping and child education. Most faithful and most understanding, she had become a much-loved member of the family. Her dark days and the devil which brought them long behind her.
And we will link this video and this channel in the description. Please go check out the original creator and the original channel. They appreciate it so much, and so do we.
Yep.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there, right?
Indeed.
And again, it's an old-timey account, so, you know, who knows how much of it is...
How much is accurate.
Right, how much of it is accurate, but, it's a really unfortunate account of what can happen. Possession is an odd one to cover, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes it happens with either very young people, like children, or it happens with women, especially old-timey accounts of it.
Right.
And it's this one especially, this is a channel, right? This is somebody who has abilities herself, but would never know it or know what to do with it in a time when, like, that type of stuff could get you burned at the stake. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, the second you start trying to explain that to anybody, you're going to be accused of witchcraft.
And it's also a period of time where women had very little empowerment or agency. And it's so important with cases like this or things like this. The person in question has to be empowered and have agency in order to gain control of the situation.
The more helpless and hopeless they feel, the worse that's going to get.
Right. That's why you see extreme escalations of these types of cases happen, again, predominantly with children or with women, because it gets out of control very easily. You're dealing with personalities that are socialized. This is such a hard thing to talk about openly, but it's true, like, socialized to be victims, socialized not to fight back, socialized, you know, children are supposed to just do what they're told and not fight back with their parents or whatever. And similarly, for at least a long period of time in history, women were socialized to be the same way.
Right.
And so...
authority figures were a lot harsher.
Right, correct. And so... when you have certain kinds of abilities like that, you will come across spirits and or the shadow people, whatever you want to call it, right? Most of the time, these are formerly human personalities. Like, I would not classify any of what I just saw as demonic. Like, as far as I can tell, there's really no such thing as demons. Or at least not... insofar as, like...
not in a literal sense.
Not in a literal sense, like minions that come from hell and work for Satan. Like, I have never seen anything like that.
More like you just have personalities that are more aggressive, perhaps, or...
Well, there are non-physically focused personalities that get themselves, for whatever reason, stuck in the physical plane, but in an astral state. And it's true that if they get stuck there for a long period, what they want is, and I've literally had them tell me, what they want is bodies. They want to manifest. They don't want to be stuck there. They don't understand how to cross back over. They don't have the momentum to cross back over onto the other side. And they don't want to be stuck in physical reality in a non-physical state is not fun.
Yeah.
Right? And it takes personal agency to be like, no, I don't want to play with you, go away. And really, they don't have the momentum to do anything on their own.
You kind of have to give them the energy to do that.
Right. If they could physically manifest, they would. If they could just take you over, they would. If they could cross over, they would. They don't have the momentum to do anything on their own. It's your energy and your fear and your sense of helplessness or surrender that allows for that to take place.
So this girl was kind of the perfect target.
Yeah, that's like I said, when you see it, it's usually young children or women that it happens to, people who feel like they don't have any agency. Because, I mean, spirits like that, entities, personalities like that, or are out there, I wouldn't classify them as evil. Although they sometimes think they're evil. Like I said, I've had ones that told me, this is hell, I'm in hell, and you get to leave. And I'm like, well, no, you could leave too, you know? There's almost always a human personality underneath there, no matter how bad or evil they're acting. There's fear and sad and scared underneath it. So, but it's so important for your energy to remain calm and stable and strong. No, I don't want to play this game with you. I'm not scared. But would you like to think about remembering maybe who you were and maybe how to get back to where you actually go? Like, you have to be able to be...
You have to de-escalate.
You have to de-escalate the situation rather than escalating it, right? And you find in almost all of these cases where things got really out of hand, you know what I mean, is there's an escalation of the energy. The person in question feels very helpless, very disempowered.
Oh yeah, you have somebody who's already in a bad mind frame, being surrounded by people that are probably freaking out and screaming about demons and Jesus, and then you bring in a pastor
Yes.
who then starts screaming about demons and Jesus.
Yes, and even the spirits that are passed on that are working with are also thinking that they're demons and they should be afraid of Jesus. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of escalation of negative energy that happens in that situation.
Basically the perfect shitstorm.
Yes. And again, I don't know how much of that is, you know, an accurate accounting. Certainly the vomiting up of objects takes you would have to be a completely open channel to be manifesting physical objects within your body and vomiting them up. It sounds like the poor thing was just completely had no control over what was happening.
Yeah. There's some elements there, like they described that they found some weird, potentially magic objects or writings
I wouldn't
or
be
something.
surprised at all. Like, okay, if there was a spirit of a woman and with her children in that house already, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the previous tenants had been putting things in the floorboards or whatever to stop the footsteps, There's a big misconception about, like, what witchcraft is actually for, right?
Yeah.
Like, it wouldn't surprise me at all if whoever was in the house previously or had been tenants in the house previously hadn't tried all kinds of different practices, spells, or superstitions.
Rituals.
Rituals in order to suppress or keep the activity that was already going in the house under control. That wouldn't surprise me in the least.
So it's not even that the girl herself was an open channel, potentially psychic, a beacon for this kind of stuff, but the location she ended up in might have also been a location that was vulnerable to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, if the original woman who had the child, right, if died in that house or had lived in that house or had in fact buried babies in the field or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like,
you're in a place of that kind of energy.
Right, that spirit was already kind of wandering around that environment looking for people to poke. And especially when you have a young person who already has abilities and they're in a vulnerable state, a state of severe depression or a state of mental health issues, can sometimes trigger that sort of thing. It triggers things to come through. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a really unfortunate
situation.
It's a really unfortunate series of events for this young woman. I'm really glad to hear that she survived and got through it. And
well, that's what I wanted to ask. In your opinion, what ended it?
Her faith, her belief in Jesus.
Like, it eventually became strong enough at that point to just kind of finally cut things off?
Yeah, well, yeah. At some point, her internal self, her soul, her spirit had to decide whether we die or whether we believe in the power of Jesus. The power of Jesus won't save you by itself. The power of faith saves you.
So it basically just got to that point where...
Yeah, the other guy can scream about Jesus at the demons all day long. if he wants to. For years, apparently.
Yeah.
She had to believe.
She had to decide that Jesus was Victor.
She had to decide that Jesus was Victor, exactly. And it could have been, I mean, I'm a non-denominational person.
Yeah.
It could have been she decided Buddha was Victor, or she decided Kali was Victor.
It was the belief is the important part.
Faith. Yeah, it has to come from the person who's experiencing it. But no, she had to decide that Jesus was Victor in order to actually make it stop, that she was indefinitely protected by Jesus. It's her faith that did it. So, and again, like, I'm not a particularly religious person.
Yeah.
So when I come across entities like that, and I mean, I do and I have.
You have a slightly different way of dealing with it, but it's still a matter of, like, internal energy.
I've had dozens of them on the front lawn. Don't be scared.
Hey, I won't. I can't see them.
But I'm a channel, and I do notice that they're there, right? But you have to be able to just be, again, I'm a modern woman who grew up dealing with this from the time I was very small and young. It used to scare the bejesus out of me, and we had a lot of problems with it when I was a kid, right? A lot of problems in the house when I was a kid.
Interesting times.
Yeah. But, you know, I grew up with that ability, and I grew up, and I eventually learned to be like, no, get off my lawn. I'm like the grumpy old lady, no, get off my lawn. We want bodies. I don't care. Get off my lawn. We're not playing this today. Go away. But, and again, if you're not feeding it the fear energy, if you're not feeding it they need the validity input of the person in question. So if you deny them the validity input, I'm a demon. No, you're not. You want to talk about who you really are? Do you remember your name? Like, that's about as much seriousness and about as much of the conversation that I ever get into with it.
Right.
And sometimes with particularly strong ones, it's like, would you like to actually go home? But that's a frequency of love and safety and peace. So you have to be able, as the medium, to generate love and safety and peace to help get them on a frequency like that so that they can move on. Like, if you come across stuff like this, I personally would not recommend calling priests who are going to shout about Jesus at somebody, especially if it's somebody who doesn't really have the faith, right?
Yeah.
That's going to escalate the situation, and it's not going to be very effective if the person themselves isn't truly a person of faith. But yeah, this is super unfortunate case for this young woman, and I'm glad that she survived and went on to live mostly a very peaceful life, it sounds like.
Yeah. She had enough of demons at that point.
And that's exactly what had to happen, is she had to have enough of demons. Done with this. Jesus is Victor. Get out. But it can be very hard, especially, like I said, with women back in the day, women and children especially, to have any kind of personal empowerment.
Yeah. It's not the environment conducive to that.
Yeah, they're not socialized to have any kind of personal empowerment, which is what it takes to
deal with that.
To deal with that situation, for sure. Yeah.
All right, well.
That's what I got. You can let us know what you think. Let us know if you think we're crazy, if you think we're onto something. If you have videos or instances, things that you'd like to see us cover, drop us a comment and let us know. Like, subscribe, all of that fun stuff.
Yeah.
And we will see you next time on Unraveling the Unexplained.
Have a good evening, folks.